Have you ever noticed that every generation gets blamed for something except one? We're obsessed with generational labels. Boomers destroyed the economy. Millennials killed napkins. Gen Z can't look up from their phones. But sandwiched right in the middle, mostly invisible in these conversations, there's a whole generation nobody talks about. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. They're the coworker who gets everything done without making a single noise about it. The parent who raised you but never needed the credit. The people who built most of the internet we're all addicted to but who barely have a social media presence themselves. And here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. Their psychology might be the most fascinating and most thoroughly misunderstood of any generation alive. To understand why, you have to start at the beginning. Not with broad cultural forces or economic statistics, but with a very specific image. Because this is where it all actually started. Picture this. It's 1978. You're 8 years old. The school bus drops you off at the corner, and you walk to your house alone. You reach into your shirt and pull out a key hanging from a shoelace around your neck, and you let yourself in. No parents, no babysitter, no way to FaceTime anyone, no Ring doorbell for check-ins. Just an empty house, the particular silence of a home with no one in it, and you. You pour some cereal. You turn on the TV, all 4 channels, and you wait. By 1984, roughly 7 million American children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. 7 million. That wasn't an anomaly. That wasn't a parenting failure in isolated cases. That was an entire generation, at scale, learning the same foundational lesson at the same formative moment. Nobody is coming to save you. Figure it out yourself. And that empty house didn't just shape them emotionally. It rewired their brains. Psychologists have a term for the environment. Gen X children were raised in a high-contingency environment. It means actions and outcomes connect directly, with no buffer between them. No parent to negotiate with, no adult to soften consequences, no system of warnings and second chances. You made a choice, and you lived with what followed immediately, completely, without appeal. When discipline finally arrived, it wasn't a feelings-focused family meeting. You messed up. You got punished. End of story. What this does to a developing brain is significant. Neuroscientists, studying decision-making and environmental stress, have found that children raised in high-contingency environments develop unusually strong perspective cognition, the ability to mentally simulate future scenarios, and anticipate consequences before they arrive. The brain, denied a safety net, builds its own. Gen X didn't develop the habit of thinking 2 and 3 steps ahead because someone taught them to. They developed it because that was how you avoided getting hurt in a house where no one was watching. That's why they have this almost eerie ability to see problems coming before anyone else notices them forming. They're not pessimists. They're running constant simulations, quietly, in real time, because that's how they survived being 8 years old and alone. But the empty house was only part of it. The other part was watching. Gen X watched their parents preach one thing and do another. All that talk about commitment, loyalty, doing the right thing, and then divorce rates exploded across the 70s and 80s. They watched their fathers give 30 years to a company and then get a pink slip during the next downsizing without ceremony or apology. The message landed early, and it landed hard. The system will betray you. People will let you down. Promises are only as good as the moment they're made. Psychologists call the adaptive strategy that develops from this defensive pessimism a cognitive pattern where you consistently expect negative outcomes, not out of irrationality, but because your actual experience has made negative outcomes statistically reasonable to anticipate. Gen X doesn't call it defensive pessimism. Gen X just calls it Tuesday. They hope for the best. They plan for the worst, because in their lived experience, the worst shows up with uncomfortable regularity. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition. And it created an emotional armor that makes them look detached to people who haven't earned their trust, when really, they're just protecting themselves from a disappointment they've already seen coming. This is also why you barely see them on social media. And this part gets misread constantly. It's not that they don't understand technology. They built most of it. The internet, the architecture of the digital world. We all live inside. Gen X engineers and developers put the bones of that together, while everyone else was still figuring out what it was. But they grew up when privacy was the default setting of human life. When you did something embarrassing as a teenager, maybe 10 people knew about it. Maybe it came up at one party, and then it dissolved. No permanent record, no screenshot, no algorithm surfacing it back to you 8 years later. To Gen X, broadcasting your life online doesn't feel like liberation. It feels dangerous, exposed, vulnerable in a way that their nervous systems were specifically trained to avoid. They learned early that the less people know about you, the safer you are. So they watch, they lurk, they observe. They don't participate not because they can't, but because they remember what privacy felt like, and they are not trading it for likes. If any of this is landing, if you're recognizing something in this portrait that you've felt but never quite had language for, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find this conversation. And if understanding the psychology beneath generational behavior is something you want to keep exploring, subscribe. This is exactly the work we do here. There's one more piece of childhood that never gets discussed, and it might be the most psychologically formative of all. Gen X grew up during the Cold War. Real, daily, institutional Cold War. Teachers gave nuclear fallout drills in elementary schools, calmly explaining to 8-year-olds how to duck under a wooden desk when the bombs dropped. As if plywood was going to protect anyone from thermonuclear war. Adults maintained this perfectly calibrated split reality. Total annihilation could happen any random Tuesday. And also, don't worry, everything is fine. When you're raised inside that kind of contradiction, something specific happens in the developing psyche. You learn to hold two incompatible truths at the same time without being destroyed by either one. You develop what psychologists, studying dissociation and cognitive flexibility, described as the capacity to compartmentalize to function fully in the present while holding awareness of catastrophe at the edges. Gen X weaponized this into ironic detachment. Everything's a joke. Nothing's quite that serious. Keep it light, keep moving, don't let anyone see you care too much. And if you're Gen X watching this right now, you probably recognize something strange about hearing all of this. You see yourself in it, but part of you still feels like it shouldn't be about you. Because caring too much, in their experience, was how you got hurt. You laugh so you don't scream. You keep distance from everything because attachment starts to feel, very early, like setting yourself up for a specific kind of pain. And yet, despite the neglect, the instability, the constant collision between what adults promised and what they delivered, Gen X developed one of the most extraordinary work ethics of any generation in modern history. They don't talk about it. They don't post LinkedIn manifestos about hustle culture or personal brands. They just show up and do the work. This was forged through jobs that would seem almost prehistoric to younger generations. Paper routes at 5 in the morning, where a 12-year-old was personally responsible for delivering news to hundreds of houses before school, bagging groceries, running cash registers at fast food places where you calculated change in your head when the system went down, because the system going down was your problem to solve, not someone else's. These weren't resume builders. They were raw, unfiltered introductions to adult responsibility given to children who hadn't finished growing yet. They watched their parents get destroyed by corporate America, so they never believed in company loyalty. That was a fantasy. The evidence had already disproven. But they became obsessed with something else entirely. Competence, value, the unassailable quality of being genuinely good at what you do. They understood, viscerally, that they couldn't control whether they'd eventually get laid off, but they could control whether they were the very last person anyone would want to let go. So they made themselves indispensable, quietly, without fanfare, without waiting for anyone to notice. Here is the paradox at the center of all of it, the one that makes Gen X genuinely difficult to read if you don't know what you're looking at. They are simultaneously the most fiercely independent generation, and the most quietly loyal one. They will never ask you for help. They've been solving their own problems since they were 8 years old, and asking still carries the emotional residue of something shameful. Research consistently shows that Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during periods of stress, not because they lack people to turn to, but because asking feels like weakness. Like failure, that programming was installed early and it runs deep. But if you need help, they show up. No announcement, no social media post about what generous people they are, no waiting to be thanked. They just do it. Because they formed their deepest friendships out of sheer necessity, when parents were absent, your friends became your family, and that loyalty became something close to sacred. They didn't choose their people casually. They chose them permanently. Their relationship with authority follows the same logic. They respect competence, not titles, not tenure, not organizational charts. If you earned your position through actual skill and genuine knowledge, they will follow you without question. But if you're an executive who talks well and knows nothing, zero patience. They will quietly undermine you while smiling in the meeting because they watched incompetent authority figures make catastrophic decisions their entire childhoods. Watergate, Iran-Contra. The AIDS crisis was handled with what can only be described as criminal negligence. Vietnam, economic policies that systematically dismantled the middle class. They learned young that people in charge don't automatically know what they're doing, and blind obedience is a deal only suckers accept. Economically, they were hit again and again. The oldest graduated into a recession. The middle ones absorbed the dot-com crash. The youngest came of age as 2008 detonated the economy. Economically traumatized in waves, over decades. Which is why so many of them have multiple income streams, not because they're naturally entrepreneurial, but because they learned at the cellular level that nothing lasts. Every job is temporary. Every company will eventually make a business decision that has nothing to do with your value. Diversify or die. Before Google, knowledge had actual weight. Gen X spent hours in libraries, flipping through card catalogs, hunting for a single book that might contain the answer to a single question. Information requires effort, time, and physical presence. And because it costs something to obtain, what they learned stuck differently, held in the memory with more permanence, more texture, more usefulness. When information is free and instant, it becomes disposable. When you worked for it, you kept it. They learned to fix things with their hands because that was simply what you did. Bike chain slips, flip it over, get grease in your fingers, figure it out. TV goes fuzzy, smack it until it works. Then investigate why it worked. Nobody called a technician. You became the technician. This built something psychologists might call mechanical self-efficacy, a bone-deep belief that with enough patience and the right approach, you could master the physical world. Those problems yielded to effort. That competence was accessible to anyone willing to put in the time. Now they're raising their own kids in a world they barely recognize. Helicopter parenting, constant supervision, social media documenting every milestone before the child has finished experiencing it. And they gave their children the attention they themselves never had genuinely, deliberately, sometimes to the point of overcorrection. But quietly, some of them wonder. They worry they've made their children too soft, too dependent, too visible, because in the Gen X framework built from years of learning that visibility is exposure, and exposure invites attack, being seen everywhere, by everyone, at all times, is not safe. It's a risk. Here is the truth about this generation, finally stated plainly. Generation X may be the last generation that genuinely remembers what it means to be bored, to sit alone with your thoughts and not reach for something to fill the silence. To encounter a problem with no internet and no one to ask, and no choice but to stay with it until something gave way. They are not better than other generations. They are just different, shaped by a specific hinge point in history, when the old world was dissolving and the new one hadn't arrived yet, and someone had to stand in the gap. They are the bridge generation, the middle child of modern history. And bridges don't get parades. They don't get recognition or retrospectives or cultural moments. They're just there, absorbing the load, holding things together, connecting what came before to what came after, expecting nothing in return. And honestly, that's the most Gen X thing of all. Not caring whether anyone notices, not needing the credit, just getting it done, quietly, and moving on. Generation X didn't become independent because someone taught them resilience. They became resilient because independence was the only option. If you're Gen X, what's the single habit from your childhood that you didn't realize was unusual until you saw how differently the generations after you were raised? Leave it in the comments. You might be surprised how many people share the exact same one.